Hello, everyone. Today, we will turn to a Roman emperor whose figure may not seem as striking as some of his predecessors or successors, but whose reign marked an important turning point in the history of Rome and laid the foundations for a subsequent period of stability. We will talk about Vespasian, whom some call the peasant on the throne. What was he like? Where was he born? What was his origin? And why is he called the peasant on the throne? Titus Flavius Vespasianus was in power from 69 to 79 of our era. For a full 10 years, he ruled in Rome, which immediately before his arrival was literally torn apart by a series of bloody and destructive civil wars, which went down in history as the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and, finally, Vespasian himself. This terrible year began after Nero's suicide in June of 68 and was characterized by complete chaos, when legions in different parts of the empire proclaimed their commanders as emperors, and Rome and Italy became the arena of fierce battles. 10 years of stable and, on the whole, successful rule in such extremely difficult conditions is indeed a lot. It is a very serious achievement, testifying to his outstanding abilities as a statesman. He ascended the imperial throne at a very advanced, almost 60-year-old age, which in those times, considering the much lower average life expectancy, made him, in essence, a very old man. His full name at birth was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Having become emperor, he, following the already established tradition laid down by Augustus and continued by his successors, adopted the official imperial name Caesar Vespasianus Augustus, which sounded not only impressive and beautiful, but also emphasized the legitimacy and continuity of his power from the founders of the Principate, although he had no family ties with them. For a man who came, by Roman standards, from the very lowest strata, not belonging either to the old Republican senatorial aristocracy or to the new imperial nobility formed around the Julio-Claudian dynasty, such official naming and adoption of titles associated with the names of Caesar and Augustus was especially important for legitimizing his power in the eyes of the army, the Senate, and the people. What makes this personality so remarkable and important in the long, complex, and turbulent history of the Roman Empire? First of all, Vespasian is a classic example of a new man, Homo Novus, on the Roman political Olympus, a man from the lower classes, almost a commoner by origin, who had no blood relation either to the ancient republican nobility or to the new imperial aristocracy that had formed and strengthened around the first imperial Julio-Claudian dynasty. With his unexpected and rapid appearance on the imperial throne, the established notion since the time of Octavian Augustus of supreme power as the prerogative of the first among the best, princeps inter pares, that is, the first among his day, formally equal senators, necessarily belonging to the noblest and most ancient families, was, in essence, definitively dispelled and discredited. Who was the emperor in Rome at that time? Let me remind you that the form of government established by Augustus after decades of civil wars was called the Principate. This meant the formal primacy, the headship of one person in the state, from the Latin word princeps, which literally translates as first chief, for example, princeps senatus, first on the list of senators. And Vespasian, unlike his predecessors, who all, in one way or another, came from the noblest patrician or, at least, influential senatorial families, was in his youth, according to some information provided by the historian Suetonius, a simple legionary, and then went through all the difficult stages of a military career, rising to the rank of centurion. A centurion, of course, was already a commander, a leader of 100, commanding a century, that is, a unit of about 80 to 100 legionaries, but still, this was far from the highest military rank in the Roman army, not the level of a legionary legate or a military tribune of senatorial rank, let alone a consul or proconsul. However, as a military leader, as a skilled, experienced, and successful commander, Vespasian undoubtedly left a noticeable and glorious mark on the history of Rome. Shortly before his rise to supreme power, in 66 to 69 of our era, he, on the orders of Emperor Nero, cruelly, methodically, and very effectively suppressed the first Jewish revolt, most dangerous for Rome, which ancient authors themselves, such as the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, a participant and eyewitness to these events, called the First Jewish or Roman Jewish War. He managed, in a few years of persistent and bloody battles, to conquer almost the entire territory of this rebellious and insubordinate eastern province, capturing and destroying many Jewish cities and fortresses, with the exception of its capital, Jerusalem, the siege and capture of which was completed by his eldest son Titus in 70, already after Vespasian was proclaimed emperor. Vespasian also did much to restore order, stability, and financial well-being in the state after the devastating civil war of 68 to 69. Under him, the construction of one of the most famous and grandiose symbols of Rome and the entire Roman Empire was begun, the Flavian Amphitheater, which is much better known to us by its later name, the Colosseum. He was born on November 17th, in the year 9 of our era, during the reign of the founder of the Roman Empire, Emperor Octavian Augustus, in a small and little-known rural village or estate called Phalakrinae, located in the Sabine region, not far from the city of Reate, which today is known as Rieti, about 80 kilometers northeast of Rome. His paternal ancestors, as we have already mentioned, were never distinguished by particular noble lineage, fabulous wealth, or great state or military glory. As the famous Roman historian and biographer Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus writes in his well-known book, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, Vespasian's family had no ancestral images, and for a Roman of that time, especially for a man aspiring to a high position in society, this immediately and unequivocally meant that it was a very obscure, almost rootless family, since the right to have and display wax masks or busts of one's ancestors, the so-called imagens maiorum at funerals and in the atrium of one's home, was the exclusive privilege only of ancient and distinguished aristocratic, patrician, or noble plebeian families who had consuls or other high magistrates in their lineage. Vespasian's paternal grandfather, Titus Flavius Petro, was, according to some information provided by Suetonius, a simple centurion in Pompey, the Great's army, during the civil war with Caesar, and according to other, even less flattering accounts, he was just an ordinary soldier who participated in the same civil wars or even a debt collector. The future emperor's father, Titus Flavius Sabinus the Elder, was a tax collector, that is, a publican, in the province of Asia, which covered the western part of Asia Minor. This position, although it could be very profitable, if not lucrative, was not considered particularly honorable or respected in Roman society, and often aroused hatred and contempt among the local provincial population who suffered from exactions and abuses by tax collectors. However, there is also another, more favorable legend or family tradition, also cited by Suetonius, that in some cities of the province of Asia, in memory of Vespasian's father, for his allegedly demonstrated exceptional honesty, incorruptibility, and fairness in collecting taxes, grateful inhabitants erected several statues which were adorned with a laudatory inscription to the most just tax collector. Most likely, this is nothing more than a later fabrication, a kind of family legend, designed to somewhat ennoble and embellish the not-so-brilliant origin of the future emperor. Never and nowhere in history have grateful taxpayers erected monuments to a tax collector, especially with such an enthusiastic inscription. But, apparently, family traditions and biographies of those who managed against all odds to break through from the very lowest social strata to the very pinnacle of power, to the governance of the vast and mighty Roman Empire, were always mythologized and embellished. The figure of Vespasian, in a certain sense, is indeed a turning point in Roman history, the beginning of a new era when origin and nobility of lineage ceased to be the main and only criterion for occupying the highest state and military posts, giving way to personal merits, abilities, and army support. Vespasian's mother, Vespasia Pola, came from a somewhat more noble and wealthy family from the city of Nursia, located in Umbria. Her father was a military prefect of a camp, and her brother achieved high senatorial rank. The future emperor's wife, Flavia Domitilla the Elder, as the same meticulous Suetonius reports somewhat dismissively, and even with a hint of contempt, was the former mistress of a certain Roman knight from the province of Africa named Statilius Capella. Her own father, Flavius Liberalis, was merely a questor's scribe, that is, a minor financial official or clerk in the treasury, and thus belonged to a very insignificant and inconspicuous state bureaucracy, not even having equestrian census. And this is the immediate family of the future renowned and mighty Roman emperor, founder of a short-lived, only for 3 reigns, but very significant and notable Flavian dynasty, the second-to-last imperial dynasty of Rome. Both his sons from this marriage, the elder Titus and the younger Domitian, also happened to be Roman emperors after his death. Vespasian, unlike some of his predecessors from the Julio-Claudian dynasty, who either had no sons or did not trust them and appointed adopted children or distant relatives as their successors, actively and purposefully sought to establish and officially recognize in Rome the tradition of hereditary transfer of imperial power along the direct male line from father to son. The Senate, of course, was categorically against such an open and undisguised establishment of hereditary monarchy, seeing in it a threat to its remaining republican privileges and influence, but Vespasian, relying on the boundless devotion and support of the army, nevertheless insisted on his way and made his sons his co-rulers and heirs. His only daughter, Domitilla the Younger, lived a not very long life and died before her father became emperor. Relatively early, also before his rise to supreme power, his wife Flavia Domitilla the Elder also died. And after the death of his legitimate wife Vespasian, already an elderly man vested with power, did not, as was customary for many Roman aristocrats, enter into a new official marriage with some noble and wealthy Roman woman, but preferred to take into his home as a permanent cohabitant or concubine his former and, apparently, beloved mistress named Canis or Sinis. She was a freedwoman, that is, a former slave, of the powerful Antonia Minor, who was the mother of Emperor Claudius, and, consequently, Canis was well acquainted with the morals, intrigues, and customs of the imperial court. In this, at first glance, somewhat unusual and even scandalous act for Roman society, one can see in Vespasian not only a manifestation of his personal affection and loyalty, but also a certain hidden desire of this extremely sober-minded, pragmatic man devoid of any aristocratic arrogance, who never tried without special need to dress up in the toga of an ancient Roman patrician, to subtly and unequivocally emphasize, yes, we, the Flavians, came from the lower classes. We are new men, but we are now connected to the imperial house. We continue and strengthen it. Vespasian, following the life example of his common but hard-working, honest, and practical ancestors, a treasury scribe and a tax collector, could quite proudly declare about himself and his family, I and my sons serve Rome and its empire, not with empty and meaningless titles that by the will of blind and capricious fate or by right of birth came to us from noble and renowned ancestors, but by our real deeds, merits, labor, and bloodshed on the battlefields for the glory of Rome. This is the fundamentally new thing that, in fact, this man, this new man, Homo Novus, brought to such a grandiose, complex, and in many ways already ossified in its traditions phenomenon as Roman statehood. He slowly, somehow very naturally and organically, without sharp and dizzying leaps, without risky political adventures and dangerous court intrigue ensue, gradually, step by step, stubbornly and persistently made his military and administrative career in a peasant-like calculating, pragmatic, and even somewhat coarse, simple way, but always with his own mind and experience figuring out where and how the shortest, safest, and surest path upward to the very heights of power and glory lay for him. His life path is a vivid example of how personal qualities, perseverance, and luck can lead a man from the lower classes to govern a huge empire. He began his service, like many young men of his circle who lacked noble birth but aspired to a career, in the Roman army, which was always an important social elevator. His first military positions were associated with legions then stationed in Thrace, in the territory of modern Bulgaria, on the restless and often raided by barbarians northern border of the empire. As a military tribune, that is, a junior officer under the mad, unpredictable, and cruel Emperor Caligula, Vespasian, a man of absolutely sound mind, practical, and devoid of any inclination to sycophancy, was undoubtedly forced, like all other courtiers, senators, and officials, to pay the most servile and humiliating honors to this young emperor, prone to sadism, megalomania, and self-deification, not in Vespasian's defense, but merely to restore historical justice. It must be said that such widespread, universal, and humiliating sycophancy as reigned at Caligula's court is hard to find in all the long and diverse history of Rome. All courtiers, senators, and officials vied with each other in the Senate, in the Forum, at feasts, shouting, demanding for Caligula ever new, most incredible, and absurd honors. Caligula, Caligula, make him tribune for life, perpetual censor, consul many times over, God, Son of God. An all-pervading, sticky, and paralyzing fear literally fettered people's will, reason, and conscience. At first, with tears of emotion and delight in their eyes, they prostrated themselves and kissed the feet of this self-proclaimed God-Emperor, and then, when his madness, cruelty, and unpredictability had crossed all conceivable and inconceivable boundaries, the same people, or their closest associates, successfully and with obvious relief, slaughtered him as a result of another palace conspiracy. Because, as history shows, it is almost impossible to forgive someone who has forced you to grovel before him for so long, so humiliatingly, and so shamefully. It was in such a suffocating, poisonous, and poisoned atmosphere of universal fear, suspicion, flattery, and obsequiousness, marked by all the features of clear political, moral, and intellectual degeneration of a significant part of the then Roman ruling elite, that young and still little-known Vespasian began his long, difficult, and arduous path to the heights of power. Rome at that time was, in essence, no longer a republic, but a hidden or, more precisely, skillfully disguised as republican institutions, monarchy. Since the time of Octavian Augustus, that is, from 27 BCE, the Roman state was de facto headed by a sole and lifelong ruler, the princeps. The very word monarch or king, rex, still aroused disgust and repelled most Romans who sacredly remembered their former republican freedom, the overthrow of the last king Tarquinius Superbus, and fiercely hated any form of open tyranny. But the milder, vaguer, and seemingly modest title princeps, which formally meant only first among equal senators, undoubtedly flattered the ear and was not so jarring to the eye, while at the same time testifying to the gradual but steady and irreversible entrenchment in Roman society of the tradition of sole and fakticheski unlimited imperial power. The Principate was, in essence, a monarchy skillfully wrapped in old and venerable republican clothes. And therefore Vespasian, slowly but surely advancing up the rungs of the service ladder on the arduous path to power, always tried outwardly to pay due respect to these still formally preserved republican decorations, institutions, and traditions. He was elected praetor in 40 of our era, and before that, he consistently and, apparently, conscientiously performed other traditional republican magistracies. He was a quaestor, responsible for finances, and an aedile in charge of urban economy and public games. He also, like many noble Romans, twice held an honorary priestly office, being a member of one of the priestly colleges. He by no means sought to somehow particularly stand out from the general mass, to occupy some special exceptional position at court or in the army, but simply methodically, stubbornly, and consistently pursued the career of a typical Roman official and military man, like many other ambitious and capable men of his time. After the post of military tribune under Caligula, he, already under the next emperor Claudius, who replaced the murdered Caligula in 41, became a legate, that is, commander, of a legion and received a responsible appointment to the island of Crete and to the province of Cyrenaica in North Africa as governor or legate of the Roman emperor. Then he was transferred to Germany, to the strategically important and always restless Rhine frontier, where he constantly had to repel raids by Germanic tribes. In numerous border wars and smaller skirmishes with the Germans, he first truly showed and tempered his outstanding military talent, personal courage, resourcefulness, and ability to lead troops in difficult conditions. In 43 to 44 of our era, Vespasian, already commanding the Second Augustan Legion, which, according to historians' assumptions, had up to 6,000 or 7,000 well-trained, disciplined, and battle-hardened warriors, took a most active and noticeable part in the famous Roman invasion of Britain under the overall command of the experienced General Aulus Plautius. This was a very serious, responsible, and well-equipped combat unit, and shortly thereafter he was sent with part of the troops to continue and expand the conquest of Britain. The Romans, as is known, conquered this distant, foggy, and mysterious island with great difficulty, persistently, and over many decades, constantly encountering fierce, furious, and stubborn resistance from the numerous and warlike local Celtic, not Anglo-Saxon as is sometimes mistakenly thought, population, various tribes of Britons, Silures, Ordovices, and others. It is believed that Vespasian, operating mainly in southwestern Britain, won about 30 major and minor battles there over several years, captured 24 well-fortified enemy fortresses and settlements, and even subjected the Isle of Vectis, that is the modern Isle of Wight, to Rome, fighting sometimes with Germanic barbarians on the Rhine, sometimes with the Celtic population of Britain. He perfectly learned all the difficulties, peculiarities, and laws of hard border, exhausting partisan, and cruel, irregular warfare, which was very useful to him later during the no less difficult and bloody suppression of the revolt in Judaea. And as a result of all these numerous and successful military campaigns, Vespasian was highly noted as a talented, energetic, and successful military leader, received triumphal honors from Emperor Claudius, including the right to a triumph, which was the highest military award, and was able in 51, this was already the time of Claudius's reign, again to occupy the high and honorable traditional republican post of suffect consul, that is, replacing an ordinary consul for several months. And here, after the consulate, which opened the way to the highest state posts, his more active court and political career begins. It must be said that he, apparently, always somewhat shunned and even feared the turbulent and unpredictable intrigues, luxury, and debauchery of the imperial court, preferring to them the harsh, simple, and understandable life of a military camp. But the temptation to be at the very center of political life, in the whirlpool of court events and intrigues, and thereby get closer to the main sources of power and influence, was probably too strong to resist for long. With the support of the all-powerful and extremely influential favorite of Emperor Claudius, his freedman and secretary for financial affairs Pallas, not Narcissus, as some authors mistakenly indicate, our hero begins to gradually and cautiously advance in the court sphere, gaining the trust and favor of those in power. Pallas, like another famous and no less influential freedman of Emperor Claudius, Narcissus, who was in charge of the imperial chancellery, was an extremely ambitious, power-hungry, self-serving, and greedy man for power and immense wealth, but at the same time, undoubtedly, very intelligent, energetic, educated, and an exceptionally capable administrator. He effectively performed the role of a kind of prime minister, or all-powerful eminence grise under Emperor Claudius, who, as is known, was a learned man, but not very decisive and not always healthy. Claudius himself, as is known from his biography written by Suetonius, had a great and sincere inclination for scholarly pursuits, for history, for the study of the Etruscan language, for philosophizing, for literary creation, but the routine, boring and burdensome duties of a daily statesman and ruler of a huge empire, apparently, weighed heavily on him and tired him, and he, with obvious pleasure and relief, delegated a significant part of them to his intelligent, energetic, and devoted freedmen ministers. And Pallas and Narcissus, in turn, to strengthen their own position and influence at court, needed reliable support from such modest but popular in the army, experienced and victorious provincial generals as Vespasian was at that time. As a result, Vespasian, apparently after some hesitation, joined the court faction that supported these powerful favorites. But, as often happens, political fortune proved to be very changeable and unfavorable. Soon Narcissus, after the intrigues of Claudius's last wife, Agrippina the Younger, was overthrown, arrested, and forced to commit suicide. And in 54, Emperor Claudius himself, suddenly and under very suspicious circumstances, died, possibly being poisoned with mushrooms by the same power-hungry Agrippina, and her young 17-year-old son, the infamously famous Emperor Nero, came to power. In the early years of Nero's short but turbulent and tragic reign, approximately from 54 to 59, the key and dominant figure at the imperial court was undoubtedly his power-hungry, treacherous, and ruthless intriguer mother, Agrippina, the Younger, Caligula's sister and great-great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. She fiercely hated Narcissus, and all those who were close to him and to her predecessor and rival, Claudius's third wife, Valeria Messalina, whom Agrippina also helped to eliminate. She immediately intended to remove them all from her path, and, if necessary, to physically destroy them, which was for her and for the morals of the then corrupt and cruel Roman imperial court a quite ordinary, habitual, and even necessary matter. And the reasonable, cautious, and far-sighted Vespasian, perfectly understanding the danger threatening him as a former protégé of Narcissus, now prudently and timely leaves Rome and for several years, as it were, completely immerses himself in private life, retiring to his modest and inconspicuous rural estate. He was by this time already almost 50 years old, a very, very respectable age for those times, and his voluntary departure from the political and military scene could well have been a final departure forever, to a quiet and well-deserved retirement. It is unlikely that he himself then assumed that, in fact, all the most important, most significant, and most glorious things were still ahead of him. I do not think that at that moment he could even once have had the audacious and sacrilegious thought of the possibility of someday occupying the imperial throne himself. No. He probably knew perfectly well that he was endowed with a certain military talent, the ability to command troops, the ability to manage people and effectively solve complex administrative and military tasks, but never, probably, even in his wildest dreams, did he think that his modest services to the fatherland would someday be valued so incredibly highly. He simply wanted to make a worthy and honest career, to ensure a good future for his sons. That, perhaps, was all he truly aspired to then. Hiding for a time from the turbulent and dangerous court intrigues and storms, he undoubtedly acted very reasonably, far-sightedly, and calculatingly. That is what life experience, a sober mind, and the natural peasant shrewdness of a man who came from the lower classes and was accustomed always and in everything to rely only on himself mean. When in 59 the all-powerful Agrippina herself perishes, whom, by secret order of her own ungrateful son Nero, they try in the most gruesome, wild, and almost theatrical way first to drown and then simply kill his associates, the political situation at the imperial court changes somewhat, and Vespasian, sensing this, cautiously reappears on the political stage. He gradually returns to court, and in 63, already at a very advanced age for active work, as proconsul receives the administration of the rich and important, though not the most prestigious province of Africa, which by that time had long been completely pacified, and Romanized by Roman troops after a long struggle with local Numidian and Mauritanian tribes. None of his numerous contemporaries probably doubted for a moment that from the rich province of Africa, he, like the vast majority of other Roman proconsuls and governors, would return to Rome a very wealthy and affluent man, since governing provinces at that time, as is known, opened up almost unlimited and unpunished opportunities for rapid personal enrichment through bribes, extortion, embezzlement from the treasury, and outright peculation. But when, about a year or two later, in 65, he returned to Rome from his African province, unexpectedly for everyone, it turned out that he had not only not become rich at all, but on the contrary, was almost completely ruined and was even forced to mortgage all his small real estate and his modest city house to his own brother, Titus Flavius Sabinus the Younger, who was more successful in financial matters and was then prefect of Rome. Sweet and touching family relations, aren't they? To somehow improve his greatly shaken financial affairs, Vespasian, according to the same Suetonius, allegedly even began to secretly earn a living by a very dubious trade for his position, selling mules, which was considered in Roman society an absolutely low, contemptible, and unworthy occupation for a man of senatorial rank. Meanwhile, as is well known, Roman senators and generally all noble and respected people, by unwritten law and public opinion, were categorically forbidden to engage in any retail trade or craft, especially one as low, dirty, and ignoble as trading, mules or other pack animals. Because of this, Vespasian immediately received from his numerous ill-wishers and enviers at court and in the Senate a very offensive and contemptuous nickname, mule driver, mulario, which, as they say, remained with him not only until his death, but also went down in history. And already having become emperor, Vespasian, as is widely known, without any embarrassment, established a rather high tax on public toilets in Rome. In essence, it was he who introduced the very concept of a paid public toilet in Rome. When his eldest son and heir Titus, a more refined and scrupulous man, tried to reproach him for such an unworthy and dirty source of state revenue for an emperor, Vespasian, according to the famous legend, silently brought one of the first coins received from this new tax to his nose and, with an imperturbable look, asked if it smelled of anything bad. Hearing a negative answer from his son, he said with a smirk his famous now-winged phrase, pecunia non olet, which in Latin means, money does not stink. With these, at first glance, somewhat strange and even shocking actions for Roman aristocratic society, he, apparently, did not openly challenge anyone and did not try to shock the public. He simply always and in everything lived by his own, very pragmatic, down-to-earth and peasant-like calculating notions. If trading mules brings some, albeit small, money, then it is quite worth doing to feed his family and pay off debts. If a tax on public toilets replenishes the empty state treasury, then it must definitely be introduced, paying no attention to ridicule and gossip. Family and state must somehow be maintained and supported. The same Roman historian Suetonius also writes that Vespasian, being in Emperor Nero's retinue during his infamously famous artistic tour of Greece in 66 to 67, allegedly had the imprudence or even the audacious boldness to often leave the hall or even openly fall asleep during the endless, hours-long and, apparently, very mediocre vocal, poetic, and theatrical performances of Emperor Nero himself, who fancied himself a great artist. So, perhaps, it was not boldness at all, but simply Emperor Nero really sang, played the cithara, and recited his talentless poems very badly and ineptly, and by no means every normal and sane person, especially one as practical and devoid of any refinement as Vespasian, could long and patiently endure these self-absorbed and agonizing for the ear, creative exercises of his. And perhaps Vespasian did not leave the hall at all during these performances, but simply, being already an elderly man, tired from a long journey and court duties, sometimes accidentally and unintentionally fell asleep in his place and snored so, loudly and heartily, in a soldierly fashion, that Nero himself clearly heard it. But the emperor, as they say, only condescendingly and contemptuously said to his associates about this, as if to say, "What can you expect from him, from this uncouth lout, a simple soldier, an unbearable rustic, understands nothing at all about high and beautiful art." Such, at first glance, somewhat simple, coarse, and even awkward behavior of a man from the earth, a man of the people, was apparently not at all deliberate, not ostentatious, and not calculated for any special effect with Vespasian. He simply always and everywhere, in any setting, behaved as his natural, deeply rooted, peasant or soldierly nature dictated, directly, openly, without unnecessary and empty ceremonies, without refined courtly mannerisms and aristocratic arrogance. His constant jokes, witticisms, and anecdotes, which he loved very much and often told, his contemporaries from high society often called coarse, not very elegant, soldierly, but they probably were so in reality, and Vespasian himself by no means, pretended to greater elegance, salon refinement, or profoundness, and so, Emperor Nero, sinking more and more into the abyss of madness, paranoia, tyranny, and self-admiration, dissatisfied perhaps with some clumsy or insufficiently obsequious antics of Vespasian, or, on the contrary, unexpectedly remembering his past military merits and valuing him as an experienced, reliable, and loyal military leader, suddenly, completely unexpectedly for many at court, appoints him at the end of 66 as commander of all Roman troops sent to suppress the extremely difficult and dangerous revolt in distant and rebellious Judea. This was, in the opinion of many experienced people in Rome, almost certainly a disastrous and even suicidal undertaking for any military leader, because it is well known that Judea at that time was, perhaps, the most restless, rebellious, fanatically Nestorian, and difficult to govern province of the entire vast and multinational Roman Empire. Beginning as early as the 6th century BCE, from the time of the so-called Babylonian captivity, when Jerusalem and the First Temple were destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, it, despite all subsequent conquests and changes of rulers, constantly and stubbornly tried to preserve its unique religious, cultural, and national identity, and from time to time achieved some degree of political independence. Its entire preceding turbulent and tragic history, for almost 300 to 400 years before the events described, is an almost continuous and bloody chain of some secret conspiracies, palace coups, dynastic strife, cruel murders of rulers, numerous popular unrest, uprisings, and various messianic and apocalyptic religious movements. Passions in Judea, finally, and to the very limit escalate, when in the 2nd century BCE the Syrian Hellenistic kings of the Seleucid dynasty, who were heirs to the Asian part of Alexander the Great's vast empire, try by force and violently to Hellenize Judea, that is, to forcibly impose Greek culture, language, customs, and pagan religion there, and thereby completely subject it to their despotic rule. But nothing comes of it. In response to these persecutions, the famous and heroic Maccabean revolt erupts, which after a long and fierce struggle leads to the temporary restoration of an independent Jewish kingdom under the rule of the new national Hasmonean dynasty. One of its later rulers, Alexander Jannaeus, who was both king of Judea and high priest from 103 to 76 BCE, according to the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, during one of the civil wars ordered about 800 rebellious Pharisee Jews to be cruelly crucified before the eyes of their wives and children, whom he forced to attend this terrible and exemplary execution. In 37 BCE, the pro-Roman and extremely cruel King Herod the Great, who was of Idumean origin and came to power with the help of Roman legions, ordered the young Aristobulus III, brother of his beloved wife Mariamne and the last, legitimate representative of the Hasmonean priestly and royal dynasty, to be secretly drowned in a pool, and then, in a fit of mad jealousy and suspicion, ordered Mariamne herself and his own sons, from his marriage to her, to be strangled. His name has since become a byword for extreme cruelty, treachery, and tyranny. But no, not even the most monstrous and sophisticated cruelties helped either King Herod or his numerous heirs and successors to finally pacify and subdue their rebellious, proud, and freedom-loving subjects. On the contrary, against him and his Roman patrons, new, ever more turbulent and fierce protests, mutinies, riots, and full-scale uprisings constantly broke out. And so, the culmination of all this centuries-old and irreconcilable confrontation, the so-called First Jewish War, or Great Jewish Revolt, which began spontaneously in 66 of our era due to the inept and provocative actions of the Roman Procurator Jesus Florus, the Roman punitive expedition, hastily sent to suppress it from neighboring Syria under the overall command of the Syrian legate Cestius Gallus, already in the first year of this war, suffered a crushing and very shameful defeat for Roman arms under the walls of Jerusalem, losing almost its entire 12th legion. Then, to rebellious and fire-engulfed Judea, the desperate Emperor Nero sends as the new commander-in-chief the experienced, cool-headed, and battle-hardened Vespasian with 3 elite legions and significant auxiliary forces. He was either to save the critical situation and restore the shaken Roman military prestige, or to be irretrievably lost and ingloriously perish in the tangled and bloody thickets of this truly endless, fierce, and terrible national liberation war. In the history of this war, there are many striking, heroic, and dramatic plots. For example, one of the most famous and talented Jewish military leaders, who at the beginning of the revolt commanded the defense of the strategically important region of Galilee, named Joseph, son of Mattathias, after long and stubborn resistance, defeat, and subsequent capture by the Romans, unexpectedly for many defected to the side of his conquerors, and later became the famous and very prolific Jewish Roman historian Josephus Flavius. He, by the way, as a sign of his loyalty and gratitude to his new patrons, even adopted their family name of Flavius and left us an invaluable and most detailed description of the Jewish War, as well as other events of Jewish and Roman history of that turbulent era in his famous works, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. Those interested in this complex and tragic period of ancient history can confidently be recommended to read the fascinating and profound historical novel by the outstanding 20th century German writer Lion Feuchtwanger, The Jewish War. It is truly an excellent, though fictional, book based on careful study of sources. Vespasian, having arrived in Judea with a well-prepared and disciplined army, conducts the military campaign very successfully, though by no means without significant difficulties and losses. Not always easy, not always morally indisputable, but always very intelligently, methodically, consistently, persistently, and with a certain degree of military cunning and even treachery. He does not rush headlong like some other Roman commanders into the heaviest, bloodiest, and riskiest battles, preferring to act surely, cautiously, and calculatingly, gradually cutting off rebel detachments from their main supply bases and suppressing pockets of resistance one by one, city by city, fortress by fortress. His associates, and even his own son Titus, sometimes urge him to immediately begin a decisive assault on the main citadel and spiritual center of the rebels, the holy city of Jerusalem, but he wisely and coolly refuses this risky undertaking, perfectly understanding that such a frontal attack on a well-fortified and fanatically defended city would inevitably lead to huge and unjustified losses among his own soldiers. And here is how Josephus Flavius, in his book, very accurately and vividly conveys the logic of Vespasian's behavior and his wait-and-see military tactics in this complex situation. The best general for us now is God himself, who apparently wants to deliver the Jews into our hands without any excessive exertion and unjustified risk on our part, and he wants to give our army a glorious and easy victory, not associated with great dangers and losses. While our enemies are destroying and exterminating themselves with their own hands, while they are being torn apart, weakened, and eaten from within by the most terrible, most destructive, and most merciless of all possible evils, civil war, civil strife, and mutual hatred, it is best for us to remain calm, patient, and cool-headed spectators of all these horrors, not getting involved prematurely and recklessly in a desperate and bloody struggle with people who, in essence, are themselves, voluntarily seeking their own death, and in mad, blind fury are furiously raging, cutting, and exterminating each other. In exactly the same way, calculatingly, cautiously, and watchfully, Vespasian would behave in Rome itself about a year later, when, after Nero's death and during the ensuing civil war, the real and enticing specter of supreme imperial power unexpectedly and almost incredibly loomed before him. "I will not hurry and needlessly get involved in this dangerous fight," he seemed to say by all his behavior and actions. "Let other, more noble and ambitious contenders for the imperial throne first thoroughly tear each other apart, weaken, and devour each other. And for now, in Judea, victory after victory, military success and luck invariably accompany him in almost everything. He enjoys the enormous and sincere love, trust, and respect of his battle-hardened legionaries, because he leads them to victory calmly, reasonably, skillfully, consistently, and calculatingly, without excessive and unjustified risk, not exposing their lives to unnecessary and senseless danger, always caring for their timely supply of food, fodder, weapons, and well-deserved rest. Under his command are 3 elite and perfectly trained Roman legions, about 20,000 first-class professional warriors, not counting numerous and diverse auxiliary units, the so-called auxilia, consisting of infantry and cavalry, recruited from allied or conquered peoples. In general, it was a very large, formidable, and well-managed military force, which was boundlessly devoted to him and ready to follow its beloved and successful commander to the ends of the earth. In June of 68 of our era, important and long-awaited news for many arrived in Judea from Rome. Emperor Nero, hated by almost all strata of Roman society, finally declared an enemy of the state by the Senate and abandoned by his last supporters, committed suicide to avoid a shameful and agonizing public execution. Madmen, tyrants, and despots like Nero or Caligula almost always ended this way in Roman history. They were either killed as a result of another well-organized palace or military conspiracy, or they were forced into voluntary suicide by their own, yesterday's closest associates and favorites. The old Roman senatorial and equestrian aristocracy was dying, degenerating, and gradually self-destructing, clearly demonstrating to all the deepest political crisis, the decline of traditional Roman morals, the decay of ancient civic virtues, the loss of loyalty to old Roman republican traditions and high ideals of service to the fatherland. Dying and degrading, it, as it were, by its inability to govern a huge empire, opened the way to power for those new, energetic, and capable people, those nouveaux riches, upstarts from the provinces, and commoners, whom Vespasian so brilliantly and typically represented at that time. After Nero's death, the Roman legions stationed in Gaul and Spain immediately and almost without hesitation declare their elderly but respected and experienced commander, the noble senator Servius Sulpicius Galba, as the new emperor. And Vespasian, still with his main army in Judea, immediately, without visible hesitation or delay, officially swears allegiance to the new emperor Galba. However, Galba, a stern, inflexible, extremely stingy, and therefore extremely unpopular man, both in the army and among the people, remained in power for only a few months, from June 68 to January 69, and already in January 69 was brutally murdered in Rome itself by rebellious Praetorians. The Praetorian Guard, essentially having sold him the throne, proclaims Marcus Salvius Otho, a former close friend of Nero and former husband of his mistress Poppaea Sabina, as the next short-lived emperor. And again Vespasian, not rushing to interfere in Roman Razbaradelstva, and not showing any personal ambitions, just as calmly and loyally swears allegiance to Otho. But Otho immediately, almost instantly, acquires a new, even more powerful and dangerous rival, Aulus Vitellius, commander of the numerous and strong Rhine legions, who is enthusiastically supported by the legions stationed in Germany and Gaul. A new, even more fierce and bloody civil war begins between the supporters of Otho and Vitellius. In this merciless and fratricidal confrontation, Otho, after a crushing defeat of his troops in the decisive Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy in April 69, not wishing, according to his own words, to continue a senseless fratricidal war and destroy Roman citizens, died with dignity by his own hand. When Vitellius was officially recognized as the new emperor by the Senate and people of Rome, albeit with some reluctance, Vespasian was one of the first influential provincial governors and commanders who also officially swore allegiance to him. This is already a truly surprising, almost demonstrative, and even somewhat suspicious political position. A position of emphasized waiting, formal loyalty to any legitimate or seemingly legitimate central authority, whatever it may be, and a clear unwillingness to actively interfere and get involved in the bloody struggle for the imperial throne. And was he, Vespasian, in any way to blame for the fact that these so-called emperors in distant Rome changed so quickly, so often, and so ingloriously, killing each other? Vitellius, however, also remained in power for only a few months, from April to December 69. His short and inept reign was marked by unprecedented and tasteless luxury, monstrous gluttony, unrestrained squandering of state funds, and unjustified cruelty towards his political opponents, which very quickly caused universal outrage, indignation, and contempt. And he too, like his predecessors, was soon overthrown and brutally murdered in Rome itself by rebellious soldiers and an enraged crowd in December 69. And so the imperial place in Rome was once again vacant. And then the legions stationed in Egypt under the command of Prefect Tiberius Julius Alexander, and then Vespasian's loyal legions in Judea and Syria on July 1st, 69, without waiting for the Senate's decision, proclaim their beloved, respected and victorious commander, Vespasian, as emperor. But he, according to the historians Tacitus and Suetonius, at first seems to resolutely refuse this high but extremely dangerous and burdensome honor. The legionaries and his closest associates, including his son Titus, persistently and enthusiastically bestow upon him all due imperial honors, proclaim him Augustus and Caesar, but he allegedly stubbornly orders them to disperse, to stop this. Mutiny even begins to threaten them with severe punishment for disobedience and violation of military discipline. And meanwhile, more and more people gather around him, soldiers, officers, local residents, representatives of the provincial nobility, and he shouts louder and louder so that everyone can hear, he is not emperor, he does not want this power, he is too old and unworthy of such honor. Vespasian, as an experienced and perceptive politician, at this critical moment brilliantly, almost ingeniously, plays the role of a modest, honest, oath-bound servant, an old and tired soldier, who primarily remembers the interests of the state and the common good and by no means strives for personal power, fame, and wealth. And unlike the inept, false, and narcissistic actor on the throne, as Nero was, he plays his complex role very talentedly, naturally, and in the highest degree convincingly. But finally, after long and persistent persuasions, tearful pleas, and ardent assurances of boundless devotion and support from his sons, friends, closest military commanders, and all his legions, he, as it were, reluctantly, with great unwillingness and under pressure of circumstances, heeded their convincing arguments. If it is indeed necessary to save the perishing empire from final disintegration, chaos, and endless civil strife, well then, what can be done, it seems he will have to take upon himself this heavy and thankless burden. We will save Rome and its heritage. He leaves his eldest son Titus to complete the long and bloody Jewish war, and he himself, with his main and most reliable forces, immediately heads for strategically important Egypt to establish control over the supply of bread, vitally necessary. For Rome, and then, already after the final victory of his supporters under the command of Antonius Primus over Vitellius's troops in Italy, he finally arrives in Rome in 70 and firmly takes all power into his calloused peasant hands. Vespasian, of course, was not a holy and sinless man, that is absolutely certain. He knew how to be severe and even cruelly punish his enemies, rebels, and mutineers, as was the case, for example, in suppressing Civilis's revolt in Germany and Gaul. But, unlike his mad, unpredictable, and bloodthirsty predecessors like Caligula or Nero, he always tried, as far as possible, to observe certain limits of reason, knew how to show mercy and magnanimity, and even demonstratively forgive and bring closer to himself some of his former political opponents if the vital interests of the state, the establishment of lasting peace, and civil concord required it. Those unwritten but important rules of the political game, those traditions of moderation, respect for the Senate and the law, which had been established by the first Emperor Augustus, but then rudely and cynically crossed out and trampled by his successors from the infamously famous Julio-Claudian dynasty, sated with their boundless and uncontrolled power, he now, having come to power, tries as far as possible to restore and strengthen. I am a man of the people. I am an old and honest soldier. I serve Rome and its people, and I will always and in everything act reasonably, justly, and exclusively in the interests of the state. That, perhaps, was his main and unchanging political credo, which he tried to follow throughout his 10-year reign. His relations with the Senate were complex, but he strove for cooperation, although he did not allow his power to be encroached upon. He replenished the Senate with people from the provinces and Italian municipalities, thereby expanding its social base and strengthening his support, and also revised the lists of senators and equestrians, removing the unworthy and replenishing them with new loyal people. He came to power at an extremely difficult and dangerous time for Rome. The vast empire was exhausted, bled dry, and devastated by many years of almost continuous civil war. The state treasury was completely empty, the provinces were agitated and in places engulfed in rebellions, the army was demoralized, corrupted by frequent changes of rulers, and accustomed to plunder and violence. The most important, pressing, and urgent matter for the new emperor became the issue of putting state finances in order. The state desperately, like air, needed money and huge sums of money to pay the army's wages, to restore destroyed cities, to maintain order, and to finance new construction projects. And he, Vespasian, with his sober peasant common sense, with his natural practical shrewdness, with his famous thriftiness, sometimes bordering on outright stinginess, and with his complete disregard for empty and hypocritical aristocratic conventions, prejudices, and proprieties, what supposedly was proper and what was categorically improper for a true Roman emperor to do, now strives to find and mobilize the necessary financial resources by absolutely any means and methods available to him, not disdaining, according to some contemporaries, absolutely anything, even what seemed humiliating, unworthy, and shameful for his high imperial position. The historian Suetonius, who was not overly sympathetic to the Flavians, writes that Vespasian, to replenish the empty treasury as quickly as possible, allegedly openly and shamelessly engaged in such financial operations and commercial transactions as perhaps any enterprising but honest commoner would have been ashamed of. He, according to rumors actively spread by his ill-wishers, bought various goods and property at a deliberately low price, and then resold them with great profit and markup both to private individuals and for the needs of the state, that is, effectively to himself, but already at the expense of the treasury. He, as they say, without much hesitation or remorse, openly sold state positions, magistracies, and even priestly offices to those who paid more and more generously for them. He allegedly even, for money, issued acquittals or conversely, convictions to defendants, both innocent and guilty, without much rasberadelstva and delving into the merits of the case. Finally, According to some of his slanderous critics, he allegedly even specially appointed to the most lucrative, profitable, and responsible posts in the provinces and in the capital the most greedy, dishonest, and openly corrupt people, so that they would steal, extort, and take bribes there as much and as quickly as possible. And then he, under some plausible pretext, confiscated all this illegally plundered and unrighteously acquired property from them in favor of the state. Not a bad, though very cynical and risky idea for quickly replenishing the state treasury. With his somewhat simple, straightforward, and even coarse peasant mind, with his unpretentious soldierly manners, he might have seemed to the refined and spoiled Roman metropolitan public too tedious, boring, stingy, tight-fisted, and even, frankly, vulgar, and thereby greatly disappoint their expectations. But no, he did not disappoint. Despite all the obvious financial difficulties and the need for a policy of strict economy in everything, Vespasian, perfectly understanding the enormous importance of public spectacles, monumental construction, and generous distributions for maintaining his imperial prestige and popularity among the broad masses, immediately after coming to power, began to erect in the very center of Rome, on the site of Nero's former forum, the grandiose and magnificent Temple of Peace, Templum Pacis, investing huge sums of money, resources, and the best architectural forces in this ambitious construction. And this magnificent temple complex, decorated with numerous works of art, including those taken as trophies from plundered Judaea, was successfully built and consecrated within a few years. And this was already an act quite worthy of a true, enlightened, and state-benefiting Roman emperor and refined aristocrat. Having come to power as a kind of accidental commoner, soldier, and upstart from the provinces, he in fact managed to prove that he fully understood, valued, and respected the ancient Roman aristocratic traditions of state building and patronage, and was ready to follow them when necessary. And for the common Roman people, for the metropolitan plebs, who always demanded bread and circuses, the new emperor began to build that very famous and still awe-inspiring Flavian amphitheater, or Colosseum, on the site of the former huge artificial lake at Emperor Nero's infamous Golden House. The construction of this gigantic and unique structure in terms of its size and engineering solutions, designed to simultaneously accommodate tens of thousands of spectators, would be successfully completed under his immediate successors, his sons, Titus and Domitian. Now the Colosseum is one of the main, most recognizable and most visited symbols not only of the city of Rome, but also of the entire grandiose and centuries-old ancient Roman civilization. During his 10-year, generally relatively peaceful and dostatично-stable reign, Vespasian and his commanders essentially waged only two major and protracted wars on the empire's borders. One, inherited as it were from his predecessors, was in distant, foggy, and still not fully conquered Britain, where Roman legions under the command of such talented generals as Agricola continued to slowly but stubbornly and consistently advance northward, conquering new territories. The other, no less important and bloody, was in rebellious Judea, which, as already mentioned, his eldest son and proclaimed co-ruler Titus was successfully completing, taking by storm and completely destroying Jerusalem and its famous temple in 70 of our era. In Rome itself, in the temple of the god Janus, according to ancient and sacred tradition, the doors were opened when the empire was at war and solemnly closed during the onset of general peace. Vespasian, extremely proud of restoring peace, order, and stability in the state after a long period of turmoil and civil wars, said, "The war is finally over. Forget about it," and with great pomp and popular rejoicing, solemnly ordered the symbolic doors of the Temple of Janus to be closed. He, as they say, very much loved to tell and listen to various anecdotes, jokes, and witticisms about himself, calmly and with a considerable dose of healthy humor, treated the fact that he was sometimes openly teased and laughed at because of his commoner origin, peasant manners, or notorious stinginess. And the main goal that he, apparently, invariably pursued in doing so, was one, to clearly show everyone, both the proud Senate and the capricious metropolitan populace, and the almighty army, that the new emperor was indeed a man of the people and, for the people, that he primarily cared about the welfare, prosperity, and security of the entire state, and not about his personal luxury, empty glory, or deification. He was, of course, far from being as simple, straightforward, and artless as he sometimes wanted to appear to his contemporaries and descendants. His thriftiness was not so much a character trait as a state necessity, and he skillfully used his image of a man of the people to strengthen his power. He also paid attention to cultural life, restored the capital, destroyed during the Civil War, supported rhetoricians and grammarians, founding the first state chairs for them, thereby promoting education and literature. His reign, despite some harsh financial measures, such as the introduction of new taxes and the increase of old ones, generally contributed to economic recovery, the strengthening of imperial structures, and the creation of an atmosphere of relative stability, so necessary after decades of arbitrariness and chaos. He also reformed the army, disbanding some unreliable legions that had participated in civil wars and creating new, more loyal ones. Already dying, as an almost 70-year-old man, he, according to Suetonius, could not resist his last, somewhat coarse, but very significant and even philosophical joke. "Alas, it seems I am becoming a god," he allegedly said to his associates, ironically referring to the already firmly established tradition in Rome of official posthumous deification of most deceased emperors, starting with Augustus himself. Perhaps he did not say this exact famous phrase, but it was by no means accidentally attributed to him, as it perfectly and accurately characterizes his sober, ironic, and somewhat cynical view of things, of himself, and of the world around him. The mad and narcissistic Nero, for comparison, was credited with a completely different, no less characteristic dying phrase, "What a great artist dies." Both, although their origins, characters, and fates were completely different, as if involuntarily continued the ancient tradition of a witty, memorable, and characteristic anecdote or saying, which, as a rule, very accurately and vividly conceals, or, on the contrary, with merciless frankness, reveals something very essential, profound, important, coming from the very nature of a particular person, era, culture, or historical phenomenon. And this is by no means an anecdote in our modern, frivolous understanding of it, but rather a brief, concise, and deeply symbolic characterization. Vespasian died on June 23, 79 of our era, at his country estate Aquae Cutilii, as they say, from some acute intestinal infection or severe fever, which he carelessly caught by drinking too much cold water on one of the hot summer days. At that time, almost all acute illnesses accompanied by high fever were simply called fever. His last severe emotional distress, which overshadowed the very end of his, on the whole, successful and fruitful reign, was apparently the unexpected news of a serious assassination attempt being prepared against him by two once very close and trusted senators, Marcus Appius Marcellus and Aulus Caecina Alienus. They were both immediately seized, and without much trial or investigation, executed by personal order of Vespasian or possibly his son and co-ruler Titus. He, as they say sincerely and with deep bitterness, could not understand how one could plot and attempt the life of a man of the people, of someone who had honestly served Rome all his conscious life and risked himself on numerous battlefields for the glory and good of the fatherland, who with such incredible effort and risk had gathered wealth crumb by crumb for an empire ravaged and exhausted by civil wars, who built for it and for its people such eternal and immortal temples, roads, aqueducts, and amphitheaters? He apparently could not and refused to forgive these ungrateful and treacherous conspirators. His sons, Titus and Domitian, inherited power, but their reigns turned out differently. Titus, who ruled for a short time, only 2 years, went down in history as the love and delight of mankind for his generosity and mercy, while the younger, Domitian, who ruled for 15 years, was remembered as a suspicious and cruel tyrant, which, perhaps, was partly a consequence of their different upbringing, characters, and their father's attitude towards them, who clearly favored his eldest son. Vespasian, despite his commoner origin, managed not only to seize supreme power in a huge empire, but also to pass it on by inheritance to his sons, thereby founding a new imperial Flavian dynasty, which, though not for long, only 27 years, ruled Rome and left a noticeable mark on its history. His reign became an important stage in the transition from the Julio-Claudian Principate to a more open and militarized form of imperial power, where army support played a decisive role and prepared the ground for the so-called Golden Age of the Antoninus, which came after the Flavians.